Well, it's 2 o'clock, so good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all here to this afternoon session entitled One Mind, More Than One Language. And what a feast of presentations we have for you this afternoon.
I will be introducing this session in Welsh, so if you would like to access a translation from Welsh into English, then please click on the little globe icon at the bottom of the screen and click on English, and our translator, Lynwen, will translate the entire introduction for you.
So if you've accessed that, you should now be able to hear the interpreter. But before I introduce you to our speakers, I'll just briefly say a few words about the context and explain the format of the session. One of the first questions one often asked when thinking about bilingualism is, how does the brain deal with more than one language? Where do those languages go? Do they exist within the same thinking space, or are they stored to all intent and purposes in separate parts of the mental worlds? Does the nature of language itself influence the way we perceive the world around us? And if so, does speaking more than one language allow one to experience the world in richer ways? When we communicate, how does the brain retrieve the appropriate language, and how and why is it the case that two or more languages do not seem to disturb one another beyond the normal practices of code switching or language transfer that is normal behavior among bilingual speakers? These and many other questions are important, but they are questions that we do not yet have all the answers for at the moment. But we are getting closer and closer to understanding these things through the untiring devotion and accomplished work of eminent scholars like the two we have lined up for you this afternoon. So we'll hear a presentation from both speakers in a moment. But I would like to note that these presentations will be given in English, one after the other, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions after hearing both presentations. If you would like to ask a question, remember to put that question under the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll do our best to ask as many questions as possible. And remember, you can also write your questions in English or in Welsh. But for now, sit back and enjoy the feast ahead. So I would firstly like to introduce Professor John Antoni from Nebicha University, who will give us a presentation on his work. So over to you, John.
Hi, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen first. Okay, just to make sure, are we all seeing my presentation? Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, let's go. So the point I'll make in the following 20-25 minutes or so is that there are many different ways, many different perspectives from which we can analyze bilingualism or multilingualism. And one which is my favorite for many reasons is that of cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience. I guess that the second speaker, Professor Thierry, will also agree with me that this is simply amazing, because we have been discovering so many things about bilingualism when analyzing how the human mind and the human brain deals with it, that it's worth commenting on it. One of the, probably the spoiler of the day is, I'm sorry for this, Professor Thierry, but I guess that his presentation will all go around the fact that languages do exist and coexist in the same place that we call brain, and that it's not possible to think of a language as a box that we can close while we open a different box, namely a different language, to speak in that language. So it's all a very interactive and dynamic system, and it is said not possible to clearly distinguish in the brain between language A and language B. Sorry for this, Guillaume, but I had to say this forefront, because if we don't agree on this situation, it's very difficult to understand what's coming next. Then we need to do something like selecting the appropriate language and the corresponding structures, words, sounds, everything, in order to be able to speak in that given language that it's our target language in a given situation, context. And for this to be done, it's not about closing the other box, because as we said, there are not boxes in the brain. what we do is implementing different sort of inhibitory mechanisms that allow us to kind of inhibit the potential disruption caused by the intromission of the other language. And we do this pretty well. For instance, I'm trying to speak in English, not my best day for speaking in a foreign language, but I'm trying to do so. And my Spanish, my Basque are kept under control. This does not mean that they are not in my brain. They are active in my brain, but I am also implementing different processes, mechanisms, just to make them not interfere in my English discourse. And this is so because I know that we are in the context in which only one of those languages could be used, simply because I know that this is an English session, and unfortunately I'm not able to speak Welsh, even if I wish. So English is the only means for communication I have. Plus, I have some previous knowledge. I knew that this was going to be in English. So, of course, I'm kind of prepared for this. But what happens in a purely multilingual scenario or bilingual scenario in which two languages do coexist, can happen anytime? Which are the cues we have? Are there any cues? And the answer to this is yes, because there's no problem at all to live in such a context in which two languages are active out there too. We deal with them pretty well because we are expert pattern recognizers. We focus on persons, we focus on subtle cues, we focus even on the face of the person, and then we are able to extract or infer some probabilities and check whether the probabilities and my behavior match. For instance, I know that when I speak to Guillaume, the most probable language we'll use, it will be English, even though we both of us know different languages too, simply because, well, I know him and my regularity extracting system has done this job for me. We don't need too many encounters with a person to get to this point. There are some studies showing that even with the first contact, we already develop some predisposition to use that language we have used with that person. And I'm going to present a very easy, brief study that we have just finished collecting data for in the Basque Country with kids that were around 12 years old. We got 200 kids and we presented them with speaking avatars that we invented. They were 4 different avatars, 2 of them speaking only in one language, Basque, and 2 of them speaking only in the other language, Spanish. And they were introducing themselves in the clips. So they were saying their name, they were saying their age, their profession, and critically, they were also mentioning the food they liked the most and the animals they liked the most. So these 2 pieces of information were critical because they were not repeated across avatars, across characters. And we asked the kids to learn this, to remember this for a different task that came later on. So far, so good. This is a very easy scenario. We learn about people's preferences every day. And then we introduced 2 new characters, not these ones. They were different, but for the sake of illustration, these are good enough. So 2 new characters, and we told them, you know what? We don't know their language. We don't know anything about them, but you need to give them something that you have already learned. You need to give them, each of them, 2 fruits and 2 animals. You could do this at random. You could do this based on whatever you want. So the prediction here was, if our kids had learned the content, meaning the type of fruit or the animal, together or linked to the language of the speakers, maybe they were going to assign the same fruits spoken by the person speaking the same language to one of the new characters. And actually, this was the case. So they were not assigning fruits and animals at random, but there was a clear bias towards putting together these elements that were spoken by people speaking the same language, even though they were not asked to do so, and this is completely incidental. So they got these regularities, and this is telling us that that even if we are learning context in a seemingly monolingual situation, because the speaker only speaks one language, we process the content together with that language, and we save that as a piece of information that we can use later on and that we use later on. Let me also tell you that we are, as we were introduced before, perfect switchers. Not perfect, but very good switchers. So imagine the situation in which I ask you to simply name these elements either in Welsh or in English. You could go moving from one to the other, saying hand in Welsh, dog in English, book in Welsh, and so on. Of course, this implies a cost because moving or changing from one language to another implies reconfiguring our patterns a little bit, and this does not come for free for the brain, but the cost is measured in brain activation at a small level and in a very small amount of extra milliseconds we take when doing that alternation or language switching. But we do that pretty well. So in summary, up until now, we know that different languages do coexist in our minds, brains, that different languages do coexist in many of our societies, that we don't need to be told who speaks what, because this is something that we get incidentally and almost instantly, and that we can switch between languages very easily or relatively easily. Plus the fact that we should all know that we have been recommended to learn at least 3 languages at the school. And this is a recommendation from the European Commission that, you know, that the European Commission cannot regulate norms or laws at the educational level, but they do recommend things. And one of the serious recommendations they have done starting from 2004 is that every school should include 3 languages. In the case of monolingual places, it should be the native language plus 2 foreign languages. In the lucky case of bilingual societies like Wales or the Basque Country or Catalonia, they could be the 2 languages that are official in the place plus 1 additional language that in this case could be foreign. So this is what has been recommended. Now the thing is whether we do this or not. And I am responding for the Spaniards. I say, no, we don't do this. So how do we deal with multilingualism at school? Well, one of the first things to keep in mind is that we are not meeting the standards already recommended by some important institutions. And the second thing to keep in mind is that we are focusing too much, at least in my context, on knowledge or the proficiency we have in whatever language, be it a minority language, a second language, or the native language, the expertise, the mastery. But we are leaving aside or forgetting, in a way, training on how to use the languages or how to manage these languages. And language use and management and language competence are, in a way, 2 sides of the same coin. So what's the consequence of focusing so much on the competence level and having things done the way we are doing in many places? Well, the consequences are huge at different levels. I'm just going to mention some at the affective emotional level because I think that they are striking. There are several studies by our group and other groups showing that fear acquisition is different depending on whether we are acquiring this fear in a native language context or in a second or foreign language context. There are some other studies showing that our reaction to the other person's anger is different depending on whether we are set in a native language or foreign language context. And curiously, there are some studies showing that the disgust we manifest when presented with disgusting elements is different, varies in intensity, depending on whether the language context is the native one or a different one, a foreign or a second language one. So these are like important implications of the language context that should not be there if we are talking about a multilingual person as a whole. So what's the solution? I'm just going to say what I think that could be a potential way of solving this, but probably this has to be tested and we don't have the final word on it, but it's worth trying at least. One way to go is leaving aside this concept of integrating languages. That means putting more languages in a school in an integrative manner and moving to a more inclusive system in which the new elements, the new languages, do take part in the system, altering the system per se. That's the difference between integration and inclusion. When something is, when inclusion is promoted, a new system comes out as a result. It's not 1 + 2 but it's a different reality. And this is not what we have done in our schools, because we have, at least in the systems I'm aware of, we have some vehicular languages that are split in different moments and times, creating different elements of the operation 1+2. They are not creating a big whole in which all the languages known by the speakers could be used freely with educational purposes. Inclusive education should be mandatory if we want to be sensitive and responsive to physical functional diversity or cognitive diversity or socioeconomic diversity, but also for linguistic diversity. So there's no other way if we want to respond to this reality of linguistic diversity than really taking that into account and creating a system that encompasses all this diversity. One of the examples that you may be aware of is translanguaging, in which, for those of you who don't know, translanguaging in its multiple definitions, my preferred one is that thinking of translanguaging as a pedagogical tool that can be used to teach languages and teach content in which all the languages spoken by the different actors in the game. So in the school, it would be the pupils and the teachers. All those languages could be used freely, relatively freely. We can make some strategic decisions as teachers on them, but we should not penalize the use of a given language in any moment in the act of teaching. This is completely different from some approaches that we have been followed for years. So it's more about creating an inclusive system in which two languages interact with each other in a relatively free manner. And as a footnote, I should say that it should be kept in mind that this can have strategic values if the school managers and the teachers make a strategic use of the languages, but this is not for the pupils per se. The pupils could and should be able to speak in the languages they know, given that they are vehicles for communication that are valid. And these the schools that have implemented the system have even discovered that this is a fantastic way to include the third language in the game, even if this third language is not known by the speakers, because as long as they are starting to get some knowledge of the language, then it can be easily used. And it's the cool thing is that we tend to go for the difficult things as we think them of. When people, I'm already advancing some questions, but when people ask, well, is this going to be the case that they will speak in a language that they don't know or they don't master so much? The answer is yes. When we forget about our limits, our adult way of behaving, and we focus on how kids behave, they do this. They like to go for difficult things because that's already an adventure. And that's the way they solve this complexity. But for this to enter in our schools, we necessarily need to break some rules, at least two important rules that have been there with no scientific grounds, but with a strong tradition. The first one is the one subject, one language rule that essentially tells us that if we are going to teach different subjects, each of them could be in a different language, but we cannot use two languages to teach the same subject. That because apparently that could create a mess or that could harm learning. But as I said, I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm saying that this is what the rule says. The one person, one language rule is very similar to this. Imagine that we have three teachers, for instance, at the school. It is possible, it's recommended that one of them speaks in English, for instance, another one speaks in Welsh, but it is not that much recommended that a single person, one teacher, speaks in one situation in one language and in another situation in the other. Okay, so it's a person language assignment that should be univocal. And this is the core of the one person, one language rule. As I said, they have no scientific grounds, and some colleagues and I, among them Professor Thierry, we have been fighting against these rules, showing that whenever you break those rules and make people learn in a different manner in which you mix languages, learning is identical. You never harm learning by mixing languages at school in a strategic manner. So language mixing could be a solution for us for going towards an inclusive linguistic system or model. And two things to keep in mind regarding the value of language mixing is that mixing does not harm learning, and that mixing is easier for us. And I will try to give just a very easy examples of this. We've been working on these questions for almost 10 years now. And across experiments, we have realized that regardless of the experiments being with adults, with kids, in balanced situations, in language unbalanced situations, in which one language is like the most spoken one and the other one is the one with less competence on. Using behavioral techniques, using neuroimaging techniques, the responses are always the same, is that whenever we mix and teach the people things in two languages, the output of the learning process is identical, at least, if not better, as compared to a learning situation which is monolingual. One of the many examples that we can give is this new element that you see on the screen. We don't really know what it is. This is an image stolen from Google Images. And we can define this with giving different definitions for it. So imagine that we give for this element two different definitions that create the context of the content. These two definitions could be either in the same language, call it language A, or one of the definitions in language A and the other definition in language B. Okay, so this is like a passive exposure to information regarding a new element, and this is sometimes what happens in our schools. Okay, so we train our kids or our adults with this type of experimental procedures for quite a long time. And then after some time, we test them on how well they recall or recognize, or actually how well they learned these elements. And what we have been seeing once and again is that it doesn't really matter whether you taught them using two languages, like mixing or alternating languages between the definitions, or whether you used a single language they know, because the outcome was always, in all the cases, the same, is that they learned equally well. And the second important thing to keep in mind is that mixing, contrary to our initial thoughts, is easier than not mixing when we are bilinguals. Remember this sequence that I presented before, like moving from Welsh to English, going back to Welsh, so this switching scenario. Now let's go to Spanish and Basque, for example, and you should say the name of dog in Spanish, and then the name of book, depending on the situation, could be either in Spanish or in Basque. When you have to switch to Basque, when you have to change the language, we already talked about a switch cost that is measured in a differential brain activity, and it's also measured in some milliseconds extra additional time you need to reconfigure yourself and then produce the thing in the new language. That's something that has been studied for long, and we know about this. This is a laboratory task in which you get a cue, and the cue tells you in which language you should produce the name of the element, versus a condition in which you always name in the same language. For instance, in this case, in Spanish, you would say perro, libro, which is the Spanish for book and dog. Fine. So this is what we know so far. But recently, in the last 5 years, there has been several studies showing that if you are bilingual and you know how to use the two languages and you have a relatively high competence in the two languages, if you are not told in which language you should speak, if you are freely set in a purely multilingual context in which you could use any of the languages you know to produce the name of the dog and the book, you go much faster than in a situation in which you necessarily need to speak only in one of the two languages. And if we go back to the beginning of the presentations, we already mentioned some inhibitory mechanisms that are the ones responsible for our capacity of inhibiting or eliminating the potential intrusion from the other languages. But if we forget about this inhibition because the language is can be used for saying the name of the things, any of the languages we know, we speak much faster than in a context in which only one of the languages can be used. So this is not a mixing cost. Here we are talking about a mixing benefit simply by leaving our people speak in the language they want, knowing that we are going to be able to understand them because we are also multilinguals and we can understand either one or the other language. So if we want to go towards an inclusive linguistic model, maybe language mixing at the school is a good alternative, knowing that it doesn't harm learning at all and that it's not that difficult for the bilingual brain and mind. But this requires necessarily that the teaching programs should be flexible and should incorporate this as a core of the projects, of the learning projects. And the teachers should be trained on this because this is not something that happens for free. It can be easy for a kid as a user of the language, but given that this can be used with a very high strategic pedagogical value, it is highly recommended that teachers and educational practitioners in general get trained on how to translanguage and how to alternate between languages with a pedagogical value. And to this end, it would not be that bad if bilingual societies establish national policies at this level. So this is the recommendation that some of us are fighting for, because we think that if we want to see things over and above single instances or islands in specific schools, and if we want to go for effective multilingual schools, then it's better if this comes from the upper levels, from the policy making level. And I will conclude by saying that it's not the same thinking of a school as a sequence of monolingualisms, meaning monolingual context, than thinking of a school as a truly bilingual school in which multilingualism is a reality in all possible moments of the act of teaching. So thank you so much. And of course, thank you to my collaborators and friends that have done all this work with me.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn I ti.
Thank you for that first presentation. Extremely interesting to see how it's possible to bring neuroscience and education and bringing them together in such an easy, and you've given us lots of ideas and things to think about. And I'm sure that a number of questions will come as a result of your presentation. So please remember, if you do have a question, either a question specifically for John or one specifically for Guillaume after he speaks, or perhaps a wider, more general question about the field of discussion this afternoon, please note those questions under the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So thank you, John, for opening this session this afternoon. So from Spain to Wales via France, and we'll have a presentation from Professor Guillaume Thierry, who's from Bangor University, and he wishes to share some interesting findings from his research. So over to you, Guillaume.
Diolch yn fawr. I hope you can hear me. Good. I'm just going to share my presentation. Can you see this? Brilliant. Okay, so, well, for something now very different from Jan Andoni. So I think Jan Andoni did a fantastic job at making things kind of accessible and fairly simple. I'm going to try to take you to a different world altogether. The idea here is I'm not going to look at language mixing, but I'm going to try to take a closer look at the effect of language on thought. And this is something that's become kind of like the forefront of my interest in the recent past, because there's a big controversy behind it, as you will see in a second. Okay, so I'll start with a kind of very broad introduction by using an example, and this is the word Torschlusspanic. I invite you to look at an article I wrote for the conversation on this, called The Power of Language. We translate our thoughts into words, but words also affect the way we think. Sorry for the long title. It's an article or a little essay to try to explain very well or better in a more accessible fashion the concept of linguistic relativity or the impact that language can have on thought. And I take this example in the article, if you want to look at it, Torschlusspanik, which is a word of German. And I used to know German quite well when I was 14, but this is a language that I've left behind. It has degraded in my mind, but I could easily be refreshed if I took the time to work on it. Torschlusspanik is a word that means basically, you can't translate it in English, and you can't translate it in Welsh. You can't translate it in many languages because it's really kind of specific to German in some ways. What it means is it's the feeling of, where it comes from, first of all. Torsch is about, or Tor is about the door. Schluss is the closing, and panic, it translates easily because it's the cognate. It has the same meaning in English. And so basically it's the panic associated with the closing of a door. Okay. Now you might say, wait a minute, that's very weird to have a word for that in German. Well, as a matter of fact, if you come to the station a bit late, just as your train is about to leave, you may have experienced this, where you hear the signal, the distinctive signal that the door is about to close, and you may experience Torschlusspanik when you think, am I going to actually get in that train before it leaves? But interestingly, this is not the only meaning of the word. And in fact, it's not even the meaning of the word that the meaning the word has anymore. Now, the word has come to mean the closing of opportunities in life. So as you get older, your opportunities in life, of course, reduce and diminish. You can't start a career of professional footballer when you're 45 because it's not going to happen. Very unlikely. And so this is the other kind of Torschlusspanik, which is more abstract. And the fact is that this word now mostly means that in German. The philosophical concept of having opportunities in life closing up in front of you, and that you're losing time. And there is no such word in other languages to express this feeling. But if you say that word in German, that's exactly what it means. And it's instant conveying of that meaning. And the question here is, does it make a difference to have a word to package all that knowledge? Or, I've just spent 2 minutes or 3 minutes explaining what this word means. But of course, I can do it. It's possible to periphrase and to explain it in language. But as a matter of fact, here the compaction is extreme. One word and the concept is transmitted. I don't need to elaborate. So is there an effect of that? Does it actually convey something? Does it make a difference between languages? This is the kind of question I'm going to ask now. So these ideas come from, they're very old. They've been around for a while. And so Herodotus, 500 years before Christ, before this era, had observed that different cultures, for example, the Greek culture, this is represented by a temple on the left, and the Egyptian culture, represented by a pyramid on the right, they're very different style, not just architectural, but also they have different religions, different cultures, and of course they have different languages. Now, the languages are so different in these times and era that they were really considered like a perfect example of differences. Because in the case of Greek, it's an alphabetic language made with letters that are decoded into sounds, whereas in the case of Egyptian, it's hieroglyphic. It represents pictograms that represent concepts and that are associated together. And they are completely different languages. And the question is that Herodotus asked was, is there a link between this difference in culture and this different language? If they are linked, maybe language and culture, or language and thinking and styles of thinking are related to one another. This hypothesis has been there for a very long time. And it has evolved and got into different forms through history. But most famously, it has been I would say, catapulted to the forefront of a linguistic debate in the middle of the last century by people like Edward Sapir and one of his students, Benjamin Lee Whorf. His famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I hope you have heard about it. It's kind of a fun idea or concept. And here an extract from Whorf that defines it. Users of markedly different grammar are pointed by their grammars towards different types of observations and different evaluations of externally similar acts of observation, and hence are not equivalent observers, but must arrive at somewhat different views of the world. The idea that different grammars, different language systems would orient your attention to the world in different ways. It's kind of very provocative thought, the idea that language can shape the way you see the world, if you want to simplify or make it a bit more compact. Now, we all know that matching terms between languages is very difficult. And that is best illustrated by the problem of translation, which is very relevant today, even though our speeches, Jan Andoni and mine, are in English. We are both native speakers of another language, Jan Andoni Basque and Spanish, in my case French. And I wish we could deliver this in Welsh, but it's not possible. But what I'm trying to say is that the terms we choose when we speak in the second language of ours might not be capturing exactly what we want to say. And that's because translation has weaknesses, and the problem of translation is kind of difficult to underestimate. So here is a couple of examples that can be kind of fun to share with you, just for the sake of the argument. You see the word that fire extinguisher apparently poses a real problem for Chinese speakers to translate. As you can see, if you stick to the characters that the word is made of in Chinese, you can get a very wrong translation, because I think everybody would agree that this doesn't look the hand grenade. I'm afraid I can't measure or hear the laughing. I hope we get some from this demonstration. This one is one of my favorites. It's kind of impossible not to resist the hilarious aspect. If you know the context, this is actually the name of a dish that is served in a buffet, a restaurant. And you can imagine that this causes hesitation to whether you would like to serve some of this dish to a friend or colleague. The thing is that the good thing is that the food is actually not represented in the picture. Anyway, so this was just to illustrate the problem. You have concepts that are conveyed by particular units. They can be units of speech or words, or concepts that are broken down into smaller concepts, but this mapping is different between languages. What is the impact on thinking? And so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis basically is the idea that this link exists, that is tangible. But there are some very big and powerful enemies of linguistic relativity hypothesis. One of them is Jeff Pullum, who's an eminent professor of linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. And he famously wrote this wonderful paper that I really recommend to read. It's great. It's called The Great Eskimo Vocabulary Hoax, which basically attacks the theory, one of the theories that Whorf was arguing for, which is that the variety of vocabulary attached to snow terms of snow, would explain different ways of thinking about snow, or different conceptualization of snow in the Eskimo, in the Inuits. Now, the thing is that this has been well debunked by Pullum. I'm just not going to spend much time on this, but he's basically demonstrating that we don't actually know how many terms for snow there are in Inuit, and that there could be many, many more terms available to us in English if we were interested in the nature and different consistencies of snow. But what I invite you to do is to look at my duel with Pullum, which happened a few years back, I think 2013, in the Netherlands. And so if you search for Pullum Thierry on YouTube, you will see that there's a 1 hour of it, and it's pretty trash. So we go into detail. And I'll be very delighted to hear from emails from you if you think I won, because it's not that easy. Anyway, it's an interesting debate. So the debate, if I map it for you here, on the left you have the universalists, people who believe that basically language is innate mostly. It's a machinery that's ready to kick off from birth, that language is universal, that grammars share structure all over the planet and in different ways, and there is no real, diversity is only superficial, and it doesn't touch thought. Thought and language are basically two separate entities. They don't really bridge together. And of course, on the other side of the continuum, if you want to consider a continuum, you have the relativists, the people who believe that language and thought are very much linked together, influencing one another. People like Pavlenko, Boroditsky, Lupian, and Athanasopoulos, who's in Liverpool. And these, the debate, the tension between universalists and relativists has been fueled by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, was basically the reminder of this debate in the last century. But the problem we have here is that all these individuals are, for the great majority, only provide, and it's not true the more you go to the right of this scale, mostly provide their beliefs, their impressions, how language could influence flow, particularly the universalists. They don't have any actually tangible data empirical scientific validation of their claims. They just tell you what they think. Now, everybody can have their opinion, but there is a problem. And the problem is, what if language effects on thought were unconscious? That is, what if you had no idea actually how language influenced thought? And if you couldn't feel it, if you couldn't have any tangible perception of it? Well, in that case, your opinion doesn't really matter, because what you can express is only what you know, what you think, what you have come to become aware of. The problem, of course, is that to know better, you have to open this to experimentation. You have to do tests, because that can reveal processes that are unconscious. And this is where we're going now. So the only way forward, I argue, sorry for the pun, it's a very bad one, but we need new raw science, like proper science. But of course, the pun is that we also need neuroscience. And the reason why we need neuroscience is because neuroscience tells us how the brain processes information independently of aspects of, I would say, your consciousness take on it. So just trying to see how I'm doing for time. That's about 10 minutes, right? So I think I have about 10 more minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Is that right? Yeah, okay, just the nod was perfect. Thank you, Angie. So I'm just going to show you a couple of experiments that we've done looking at the potential effects of language on perception and object recognition. And then I will finish with our latest experiment, which I think is the most disturbing and the most complex, but the most interesting in terms of what it tells us about the link between language and thought. First, we back about 10 years, 11 years, we started looking at the perception of colors in relation to language. And that's because there are some well-known distinctions between terminology, use of words in different languages that may relate to perception. So here you have the case of, for example, in English, blue, in Welsh, glass. Glass is very interesting as a term in Welsh, by the way, just a parenthesis, which I think is fascinating, because glass historically, if you go back 300 years, was actually a term, if I understand correctly, and if I read the correct sources, that would describe brown, gray, blue, and green all together, and because they're all color of nature. And so basically glass was the color of nature. And it's fascinating to think that colors as diverse and different as brown, gray, green, and blue were all connected into one, basically the color of water, the grass, the stone, and the trees, and the earth. So natural colors. And then glass eventually became green and blue only. And this is why you have so many terms in Welsh that use the word glass, but actually describe something that's green. And of course, then Gwyrdd emerged and glass remained only for blue. Anyway, that was just a parenthesis. That is fascinating, is how historically the terms progress and change. But here, in the case of English, blue describes, the same term describes light blue and dark blue. It doesn't mean that you can't find more precise terms for these colors, but this is the basic term. That's the term that everybody will name these colors by. So if I was to present, I hope you can see my cursor, but if I was to present a dot like this in that color on the screen by itself and ask you to name the color amongst other orange, green, and pink dots, you will call these two blue. And that's been experimentally shown. But if you were to present the same two dots to a Greek person, a native speaker of Greek, they would call this ble, because that's the equivalent of blue in English. But they would call this chalazio, because actually this is not blue or ble, in Greek, it's chalazio. It's a specific independent basic color, which is light blue. And so what we did in this experiment here is we presented participants with flashing dots. It's one of the most, famously one of the most boring experiment I've ever run in my entire career. But it's very, very tough for the participants, because for 50 minutes, they're sitting in front of the screen seeing flashing dots. And believe me, it is not particularly enjoyable. But it's not also, it's minimal torture. But it's important to do, because we could get insights that we would never get any other way. We looked at the difference produced by the brain in a completely automatic fashion. The brain responded spontaneously to this difference between the light blue and the dark blue. Their objective was to spot squares. So every time there was a square, irrespective of the color or shade, they would press a button. And the rest of the time, they had nothing to do, which means that they became very, very bored, I can tell you that. But the interesting thing is that their brain detected the difference between the dots when they change color automatically. And what's fascinating is that even though all the brains of all the participants detected the difference between light blue and dark blue and light green and dark green, only the Greek showed twice the response, twice the difference for the blue contrast as compared to the green contrast. For the British or English speakers, the blue and the green contrast elicited exactly the same difference from the brain. There was no difference. They were the same size from the brain response. But the interesting thing is the Greek, as we predicted, responded twice as much to the blue contrast as the green contrast. I hope that's clear. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not going to show you the results because it could take a long time to explain. But the idea here is that the brain of the Greek participants responded to the blue contrast in line with the distinction made by their language between light blue and dark blue, halasio and ble. And that was predicted, which we thought may indicate or was evidence in favor of the idea that language shapes their perception of the color. Now, incredibly, we were able to reproduce this with objects later on. So a few years later, we tested this with objects, and we looked at the distinction between cup and mug as two objects that are clearly different in English. Now, it's true that you can call this object a cup of tea or coffee. But if you belong to certain circles of people, I would not recommend you calling this a mug in a tea party because you'd be thrown out or you'll be running into trouble anyway. But in Spain, you would never have any problem because both these objects are called taza. There's no difference. They're both the same object, or they've both got the same label, I should say. And so what we see is we replicated exactly the same effect that we found for colors, but with objects this time. That is, in English participants, the distinction between this cup and this mug was visible in the brain readings. We could see a clear difference, but this difference almost didn't appear. It was cancelled, literally cancelled in the Spanish participants, and they were the same stimuli. The only difference was that these participants were either native speakers of English or Spanish. So I hope everybody's following this. And now I've kept most of the second part of my talk to talk about this, which is the latest results we got in our lab. In fact, I'm a bit frustrated now after 10 months of being, basically at home, working from home, and not being able to go in my lab because I think we've hit I would like to call it a singularity. We've almost hit a completely new paradigm here with this experiment, where we managed to connect three concepts that are considered really sparse or different in terms of cognition: language structures, time, and space. Already connecting time with space is a big business in cognition, but here I'm talking about connecting also language with time and space, in kind of trying to demonstrate the direct connection there is between language structure and our ability to think. So by way of introduction, I'd like to show you that there is a very clear link, and it's prevalent between language and time. Between language and time, yeah. Between time and space. I'm getting there. Between time and space. So after giving, that's an example of a little sentence that I wrote just for example. So after giving a similar presentation in China back in October 2019, I was looking forward to giving it again and hope to continue in the years ahead. Now, there is nothing weird about this sentence. It's a very common sentence to say, right? However, if you look carefully, you can see that the word back here, which mentions the past, has nothing to do with time. It's talking about back. It's the position behind me. And I was looking forward. So I'm going to talk about the future. And clearly forward is in the front, is the future. To give it again and hope to continue in the years ahead, again, the future. So in that short sentence already, there's this kind of natural, simple, almost seamless use of space terms to refer to time, that is future or past. Back, forward, ahead. Now, get ready. I hope you can put your seatbelt on. We're going to have a crash course in Chinese. It's going to take only 30 seconds, so you have to hold on very, very well. This is a timeline from left to right here. We're looking at the back and the front. The back is on the left. The front is on the towards the right. And now is in the middle. So tomorrow would be towards the front because it's the future. And yesterday will be towards the back because it's the past. And of course, the day after tomorrow is even more in the future. So arguably it's after tomorrow on the side of the front. And the day after, before yesterday is before yesterday. Then next year, and then last year, and then the year after next, and then the year before last. So I hope everybody's okay with that. It's just a timeline going from the oldest time towards the very far back to the furthest time in the future. Now, if you translate these terms in Chinese, the day after tomorrow translates as Hu Tian. Hu Tian actually in Chinese means word for word back day. Okay, I let this sink for a while. It actually means back day. The problem is that it's actually towards the side of the front in our orientation back to front. The incredible thing is that it's completely symmetrical in Chinese, very logical language. Tian Tian, which I can't pronounce very well, it's Chan Tian, which is the day after before yesterday, is actually from day. And you might think that's a very weird thing. Actually, it's not only weird, it generalizes to the year case. There is Hunian, which is the year after next, so 2 years away in the future, is actually back year. And Tianyan, which is the equivalent of Hunian, is also frontier. So I don't know if you're confused yet, but there is a problem here. The situation is that these words that depict events in the future refer to the back space. And if the language relativity, linguistic relativity, or the language on thought theory has got any kind of bearing here, we could think that this might mean that for these people who speak that language, people who have as a native language Chinese, there may be a problem with orienting in space the timestamps of these dates. And this is exactly what we set out to test. But we didn't test just by asking them, because if you ask them, you probably will get the same answer as what I got when I actually asked a student, a postgraduate student in Cambridge. I was explaining to her about 2 years ago, well, 3 years ago, I was explaining the concept of this study we were running. And I said, you see the future's in front. She said, yes, I know, future is front. And so we're trying to see if the fact that, how do you say the day after tomorrow? And she said, Hutian. And I said, well, isn't it back day? And she looked at me with an interrogation on her face, which is very, very strange. And she burst into laughter, says, this is ridiculous. It has nothing, language is arbitrary. It has nothing to do with my way of thinking about these words and time. And I spent the next 3 years to demonstrate that she was probably perhaps wrong. So here's what we did. This is a different type of torture. It's much more interesting. We ask participants sitting in the lab. So here's a participant sitting from above. We present them with speakers that are in the front or in the back space. And we had to actually install the lab for that experiment especially. And we present them with dates. Here, for example, 2020, which would be the year 2020, and from the front, or 2020, that's just examples, in Chinese from the back. Now, here are the instructions. They look complex, but actually they're incredibly simple. So bear with me for a second. The experiment took place in 2018. Okay, that's what you need to know. If you hear 2018, irrespective of where it comes from, it doesn't matter. When you hear 2018, you press 2 buttons to say that's basically the neutral case. But now there are 2 other cases. If you hear a year that is 1 year in the future or in the past, you press the 1 button, whichever it is. Say there's a button, you press 1. And if you hear a year that is 2 years in the future or in the past, like 2020 and 2016, because we're in 2018, you press the 2 button. And that's the simplest experiment you can do. So the participants sitting there, they hear 2020, they press 2. They hear 2017, they press 1. They hear 2016, they press 2. You get it? So 2 buttons, button 2 for 2 years gap, and button 1 for 1 year gap. That's all they have to do. They don't have to remember if it's in the future or in the past. We don't care. And they don't have to figure out whether it comes from the front or the back space, because we don't ask them to look at this. We have tested at the beginning of the experiment that they could tell whether sounds came from the front or the back. But we didn't ask them to report that. It's irrelevant. Okay, now, This is the result. I'm sorry if it looks complex, but let me just walk you through it. What you see here on the right, this graph here, is the response of the brain of Chinese English bilinguals tested in this task. The red line, well, the white lines first, is to show you when the case, I should go back 1 second here, the case where the Hutian stimulus, that is the year after tomorrow, after next, which is 2020 in 2018, was presented in the front. When 2020 is presented in the front, that is incompatible with the way Chinese put it, because 2020 is 2 years ahead, it's called back year. So back year should not come from the front. Effectively, the brain should be confused by it. If 2020 comes from the back, it's fine, because in theory, it's back year. And so here is what you see. You see that when it's okay, when it doesn't clash with the Chinese version of terms, or the Chinese orientation for time, this is the response. And when there is a clash, that is when the orientation, the location from which the year is played is incompatible with Chinese, you get a difference. And this is the response of the brain. This is this blue wave here that you can see, which means that the brain has said, hey, wait a minute, this is the wrong location. I can't process that properly. I'm struggling. But where it becomes, so first of all, it shows that this language structure that exists in the brain is influencing the brain in processing information. Note that we're not asking them to know if it's the future or the past or front or back, it's irrelevant. But the brain is doing it automatically and unconsciously at the speed of light. It's exactly at the same time as any other process of meaning in the brain. But what's fascinating is that if you show them the stimuli in Chinese, hold on to your seats. This is the moment of truth. You show them the names of the years in Chinese. All these effects are gone. And it's not just random. It's not just aberrant coincidences. We did this for years, and we did this for days of the week. And we have exactly the same patterns, because the day after tomorrow and the day before yesterday are the same. In other words, the brain automatically maps time with space in a language-dependent fashion. And then it doesn't matter whether the participant is doing anything active to recognize this. They are doing it automatically without knowing. So I come to my conclusion. No participants' knowledge. They had no idea. They had no idea what we were testing. Even after debriefing, they didn't know. It had no effect on their behavior. The response pattern on 1 and 2 were completely unaffected by this process. So in other words, we can safely say that the participants just didn't know what we're doing. But their brain managed to process the information exactly in the way we predicted. So I would like to claim that language interacts with all other cognitive processes. And the other is a provocation, because for the sake of my good, of my good feeling about these things, I don't understand why people classify language as non-cognitive, because for me, it is a cognitive operation. It's cognition, pure cognition. So I like to add other here. Language interacts with all other cognitive processes at every level of complexity and all the time. It's a fully integrated. So refer back to Jan Andoni's point, which was a very welcome introduction. He said, language interacts in every possible way. And if you have several languages, they all interact together. And this interaction is unconscious, ubiquitous, and deeply embodied. It relates to all aspects of your biology. And of course, it changes with languages. So if you move from one language to the other, you have a different pattern occurring. In other words, that's a case for bilingualism and multilingualism, because it augments the richness of the thought environment in which you find yourself. And maybe because this is all unconscious and you have no way of realizing this, maybe this is why you won't believe me. But more importantly, maybe this is why there is such a controversy, because it's so counterintuitive. People think one way. They tell you, they lecture you on how language should never influence language, but thought. But actually, they don't know. The only way to know is to test it. Thank you very much.
Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn I ti, Guillaume.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, for that presentation. A presentation which has certainly raised lots of more interesting points. And I'm sure that a number of us are still there processing much of that information and trying to come to some questions, so we can open that up to the floor or to the audience. We do have one question that has come on the Q&A, and I know that John has already responded to that, but we may come back to that in a moment for you to hear a little bit more about that question. But a question has come in on John's presentation, so I'll begin there. And this question, and I'll turn to English for this question, because the question was asked in English. And of course, you will respond to it in English as well.
Learning, that's something you mentioned in your presentation at the beginning, John. But what is your opinion about mixing languages in class? If the aim of that class is to help pupils learn to, for example, write a narrative in an effort to improve competence in a particular language, especially in the context of, let's say, non-balanced bilingual pupils who do not hear their weaker language other than in school. An obvious example there would be the Welsh context. So think about, children who aren't exposed to Welsh in the home. Their only exposure is in the school. The school system is there to try and encourage and help develop their Welsh. What's your take on that? So what's your opinion about mixing those two languages in the classroom in those kinds of contexts?
Well, thank you for the question. If the context you refer to is the specific moment in which we want to work on a given competence, which is language dependent, of course, it wouldn't make much sense to mix languages because that could be distorting for the process, but only if we are working a given competence in one language, okay? Such as the case in which, the question is set. But this is not typically how it works at the school, because many times we are working above the language level. We are working concepts that then could come in one language or the other, or in the two languages. Okay, so language independent, meaning that the academic content to be worked is not language per se. In those cases, even if participants or if pupils are multilingual with a high difference in the level of competence of the languages they master, doesn't really matter at all, because we have shown so far that even for those types of non-balanced bilinguals, they are equally good at learning things when they come in two languages as compared to a single one. And this is, again, as Guillaume was saying, some of these results are counterintuitive, because we may think that by putting everything in the, so to say, easier possible situation, the native language context, that would be better for them. But remember that schools nowadays are not monolingual at all. So we cannot think of a school as a monolingual place anymore. So they know that two languages are present in the same context called school, even if there is a big distinction between the time devoted for one and the other. Okay, so it's not a monolingual context anymore. Therefore, there is no a given better position for language A as compared to language B.
Okay, and can I push you a little bit further on your definition of translanguaging as you presented it? I think it's fair to say that the original definition, which was coined, as it happens in the Welsh context, did have more of a sort of a strict pedagogical approach behind it, that allowed for the embracing of the larger community language, which was English, that was way more available in resources and those kinds of things, which is still the case to some extent. To allow children to embrace their sort of understanding of English, to make use of those kinds of resources whilst having their education through the medium of Welsh. So and the idea was that, bringing the two together in a controlled fashion in that way would also deepen their understanding of, the subject matter that they were looking at. However, the definition seems to have moved more towards a sort of a code switching sort of approach, where individuals are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your sort of pitch was more towards that side, in the sense that the child should be able to draw from their full repertoire of linguistic knowledge in dealing with what they're doing. So I'd be interested in your ideas in terms of a minority language context, where the schools are geared towards language maintenance. How do we balance that out in the classroom?
Well, to start with, I fully agree with there are multiple definitions of translanguaging out there, and that the original one is that one. But the one that I'm taking and we are taking in the schools I'm working with is the more flexible one in the sense that it's more about giving something in a given language and having the possibility to move it to a different language level in a different language as an outcome. Okay, so it really is about input, output, and transformation between, therefore, this translanguaging situation. But this is essentially the essence of translanguaging, but without so many details at the strategic level. Yeah, okay. And the last thing is how to, well, you were asking about how to bring this translanguaging to reality in a school. This is not that difficult if there is a minimal knowledge of one of the of the two languages to be used. At least we can include more languages in the game, and that shouldn't matter. As long as there is a minimal knowledge, it works pretty fine. We are doing translanguaging approaches in the Basque Country with people who speak a minority language, Basque. Typically, Basque is not the most spoken language, even though the level of competence is kind of balanced with the Spanish out there, but the level of use is not the same. And what we have been seeing after 1 or 2 years of translanguaging approaches is in some Ikastolas, so some Basque schools, it turns out that people go to a more balanced use of the languages out of the school too. Something that before was not happening. So before was happening that the level of knowledge was very high, is very high, but the level of use is not that balanced. And Spanish was the predominant language out there. And thanks to these approaches in which we bring the two languages together to school and we promote transformation from one to the other, what we are seeing is that this has a carryover effect that opens the door of the school and brings it back to society.
Okay, great, thank you. Moving on to some questions for Guillaume. So there's a question here. How can you test extensively something that is inherently unconscious? This theory cannot possibly be proven conclusively. What's your view on that, Guillaume?
So this is a really good question. So I don't know about I just seen the question. I discovered it in the open section. Yeah. So the issue here is the word extensively is a bit is my most problematic word in the question. I think I can answer probably safely with some assertive kind of content for the rest, but the extensively is a problem. By definition, the unconscious is not accessible to direct observation. If you ask someone, I just gave this example about this Chinese student, who was asked her, what about the day after tomorrow in Chinese? Do you think it's in the back or in the front? And she said, the future is in the front, no problem. And then just burst into laughter when I referred to the fact that it translates back day in Chinese. And she said she just brushed it and said it's irrelevant. We know very well that language is arbitrary and these are labels. They don't mean anything by themselves. They just refer to a reality, to a concept, and we don't care whether it says back or front. What matters is that it just refers to the day after tomorrow. And as a matter of fact, she was probably right if you look at it from a purely conscious awareness standpoint. But as soon as you look at the unconscious side of this, that is how the brain actually processes that information, you can see that is not the case. And so the point here is that we can test what's happening at the unconscious level if we have the right tools. For example, by measuring responses directly from the brain. So electrophysiological waves, for example, electricity produced by the brain that you can measure on the surface of the scalp. It's non-invasive, it's painless. Will give us an idea about how the brain processes information. It doesn't need to relate directly to what the participant experiences intuitively or if you want introspectively or is aware of. It's just a matter of how the brain solves the problem. You might want to say then, well, who cares? Because then if it's unconscious and it doesn't translate into the conscious or into our behavior, it has no impact. So who cares that this is what's happening at the unconscious level? But that would be a big shortcut because we don't actually know what the impact of unconscious processes is on the conscious and the overt. Of course, in these extremely controlled conditions, you can measure it. And this is where the extensively part of the question is very difficult to answer. Because as a matter of fact, we measure here an unconscious process. We don't know what its impact is, but the fact that it's there so easily, they're clearly measurable, predictable, and always there for a manipulation that is so subtle. I mean, have you seen how simple, how subtle it is? We show a date in English that comes from the front space and that is in the future or the past. This is irrelevant. All of this is irrelevant. We don't care that it's future or the past. We don't care that is front or back. The only thing that matters is that it's 2 years or 1 year away. And the brain, at the speed of light in real time, computes the aberration of the combination of these factors. Of course, here it's a very small effect and it has no impact on the person's belief or feelings. But what happens when you multiply this by all the information that we unconsciously process every day, every second of our life? That gets a little bit more complex. Now, I don't know how we can test all this and map it. It's just the beginning, but this is definitely exciting because we're starting to understand better how the unconscious mind works, which I think is fascinating. So that's how I would respond. I don't know about extensively, but the rest, yes, I think we can do it.
Okay. And a related question, which I think brings in the next question on the Q&A as well, is one of the themes or one of the clear messages that has been presented throughout this conference, starting with the presentation from Antonella Sorace and Li Wei at the beginning of the conference, is that, you know, everybody's language experience is different. So everybody experiences language different. Everybody has different exposure levels to languages. They engage with languages for different reasons and so on. So everybody's relationship with language is personal to themselves. Now, when we do these kinds of experiments, and I definitely see the place for these experiments, but when we do these kinds of experiments, how easy is it to ensure that the stimuli and, you know, the sort of the type of language that we're expecting them to respond to actually reflects the kind of language that because it's almost like we're making some assumptions about an individual's perception of reality. And I'm thinking in terms of myself, in terms of my understanding of the extent to which some words in English mean something is different from what other people seem to think, because they seem to use those words in a different context. Whereas I think that my understanding of those words is correct. But it's very different. So how do you manage that in these kinds of testing situations?
So I think you're asking, if I try to summarize it, you're asking the ecological question. Yeah, what is the does this represent a reality that is out there in the world? And here we need to be very careful. Science can only test theory, theoretical hypotheses, and it can test them on a kind of abstract level. We cannot look at the individual patterns of a response of someone with a particular linguistic makeup, a particular knowledge of vocabulary, a particular level of achievement. It's almost at the moment anyway, with the techniques that we have, it's impossible to look at what their particular representations are and in a realistic context. So these experiments are very, very artificial. They are highly controlled, highly abstracted, and there's no question that they don't represent what happens in everyday life. But the game is here to test some questions that are generic. So the question, remember, if you go back to the original, the start of my talk, the question is, does language have a bearing on concepts, on the way we think, or conceptualize information and reality? And I would posit the answer as a yes, or at least we have some evidence. And I've given you 3 examples, one in the domain of color, one in the domain of objects, and one in the domain of time-space relationship. There are many other examples, but I couldn't review them today. But there are quite a few examples here that in principle, language structure can shape, constrain your way of thinking. It's a principle, it's kind of like a theoretical level answer. I cannot talk to you about individual cases. What happens when I watch a movie in English and I speak Spanish and Welsh? I can't tell you what will happen in realistic conditions like this, because the number of factors intervening is so complex that this is it's more like a natural situation where it's very difficult to know what's going on. But we can answer theoretical questions, abstracted questions like this. I think that's quite interesting. And I see that there was another question by the same person about the fact that the study that I showed was only about Chinese English bilinguals. That's absolutely correct. The reason why it was Chinese English bilinguals is because there's this relationship between the vocabulary in Chinese and this situation of time-space relationship. You won't find that in other language pairs, so that's why we use that. But note that the color examples from Greek, English, or Greek participants, and the object examples from Spanish, and you can find a lot of examples where you can change the language pairs depending on the question you're asking. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a similar sort of question, but maybe both of you could present your thinking around this. So how does the cognitive process alter with fluency? So does this matter for how we teach or encourage people to embrace multilingualism? So I think that's one for both of you.
I mean, Jan and Lee, we've worked together quite a lot, and he can answer this question, no problem. I mean,
that's the key. I think that the two of us are aware of the importance of fluency understood at the cognitive level, not only at the language level. So, of course, if we are speaking in a language, so me now speaking in English, being tired, I have two small kids that have given me a bad night. So I don't have too many resources. Therefore, my cognitive fluency at the moment is not fluent, so to say. Yeah. So I'm at the risk of making a lot of errors, linguistic errors, and not only linguistic errors, but other types of cognitive errors too. Of course, fluency is the key to all this. But our intuition is that if we go to the way languages are being taught at the beginning, if we go to the manner in which we approach languages, we can change the potential outcomes at the fluency level. So the differential effects that Guillaume or I have been mentioning, depending on whether we use one language or the other, those things should not be there, unless there are some structures of the language that point to that, of course, right? But we should not be more or less afraid of a situation being in a native or foreign language context. These things are super strange, and it's just the consequence of the way we have approached the languages. And that's about fluency, I'd say.
If I may add that there is another factor that it tends to be, I wouldn't call it ignored, but downplayed, and it's exposure. So fluency is very important. It's clear. If you are very fluent in a language, if you know well its structures, you're much more able to express yourself in that language and to understand information in that language and manipulate it. But another thing is exposure. And this is where the Jan and Denis' presentation was, I think, an eye-opener, really interesting, is that when you mix languages, you're not just testing the fluency of the two languages. You are also bringing the exposure levels of both languages. You're raising it up. And exposure is very important. Even when you have low fluency, everybody who's been attending a foreign language course knows that. The minute you're in the class, when you arrive, the first 10 minutes, it's the nightmare. You think you've forgotten everything. You can't get started. You can't answer the questions you're asked. You don't remember the vocabulary. By the end of the session, you're starting to form full sentences. You're starting to feel a bit more confident. You're finding your words. Why? Your fluency hasn't changed in the matter of 1 hour. Of course it can't. What has changed is your exposure. The activation of all these representations in your memory are much more alert, much more there, and therefore you're more able to intervene, to interact with people. And that's the double manipulation here, is you're using exposure as leverage to access more fluency. Does that make sense? And I think that's where the trick is powerful.
And if I could add something to that, I would say also that the different learning scenarios are critical here, because some of the questions that we already talked about were on this. It's the CLIL approach. So teaching languages with content and for content acquisition, that's very different from teaching a language as an academic subject per se, which is also fine. But languages were invented for communicating, right? Not for learning themselves. So we should make use of the languages in such a way that they give us access to new content different from the language itself. So if we approach these CLIL-like models, probably we are going to partially at least solve this fluency that comes after all this process. And when I say this fluency, I talk about the cognitive disfluency associated to a foreign language use, for instance.
Yeah. Would you, in your experience, does the CLIL model often verge towards translanguaging at all, or is it almost a monolingual? Are we again in the CLIL model talking about siloing some subjects into being subject taught through the medium of X, whilst the other subjects are taught through the medium of Y? Is there room for how do they work in your context?
At least around me in Spain, CLIL has been not that useful to foster real multilingualism in a school, because it has been implemented in such a way that it's again one subject in a different language, be it science. Instead of being English as a subject, now it's science being taught in English. Fantastic. So we have given a step, but the real step is breaking these boundaries of subject A, subject B, and using the languages in a much more transversal manner, as we were mentioning. And CLIL is the perfect base for that, because we already approach content through language. Now it would be about approaching content through languages.
A question for Guillaume: can you find any examples from cultures where from culture which reflects the differences in orientation that you found in the experiments with the Chinese bilinguals?
Oh, absolutely. So there are some very interesting. So if I understand the question correctly, yes. So in Aymara culture, which is a language from South America, I think it's it's north of Peru, so there's 7 million speakers of Aymara, and in Aymara the language has reverse orientation for time, which is fascinating. So the future is in the back, and the past is in the front, and it's the language perfectly captures this, but it's also in line with the conceptualization this time, which is very interesting. And it also sheds light on what's happening with Chinese. So the idea, one of the best explanations I've seen of this is the fact that it's all dependent on the reference point. So in the modern world, if I may say so, most cultures today have got an ego-centered reference, a self-centered reference for time. That is, you're considering that you are evolving through space. And of course, as you're moving forward, you are going towards the future. So the front to the future, you're moving towards your future, and you leave your past in the back, which makes sense. So it's a motion metaphor, and it's ego-centered. But in history, there are lots of other cultures that have had a world-centric view of time. And let me explain how it works, is that instead of you being the subject that evolves through space and represents this changing of time, it's the world that's passing by. You are stationary, you don't move, but the world moves. And therefore, what's in your back is what you haven't seen yet. It's the part of the world that's undiscovered. And the part that's before your eyes is what you've seen, what has happened. It's the past. Therefore, what's in the front is what you can see, and therefore it's the past. And what's in your back is what is unknown at the moment. And so in Aymara culture, this is very much a world-centric system, where the past is in the front because you know it already. And the very interesting phenomenon here is that Chinese has very likely inherited this. So in fact, historically, it was a world-centric system for time passing, but it has over time, over millennia of evolution, changed. But what's been left behind is these expressions like back day or back year to talk about something in the future. And that's a leftover from very ancient language, which has been so, if you want, embedded in language that it's still there. And it has still an impact on the way the brain processes information, even though you could say it's completely irrelevant. As far as I'm concerned, they could perfectly decide on, perhaps a Chinese revolution on culture from today is going to be 2 days in the 2 days in the future and frontier 2 years in the future. But that's not going to happen, I think, because it would cause a huge confusion for a long while. So unless they used another word yet not used.
We just had another addition to what you were saying there in terms of the language itself, that Aymara is the main indigenous language in Bolivia as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's right.
So we're almost we're drawing to a close with time, but a final question I'd like to pitch to both of you. One of the themes that we've been going after quite a lot in this conference as well is around education. The whole of Wales has undergone a huge education reform over the past 5 years or so, and this is accumulated in a brand new curriculum. And as part of the new curriculum, it's our vision to have a more multilingual approach that brings the languages together in the classroom to enhance children's metalinguistic understanding and their metalinguistic knowledge, in order to try and develop their multilingual skills better than what we're capable of achieving at the moment. What would be your idealized approach towards multilingualism in the classroom?
That's a really good question. I'm going to have a shot at this, and I think it's quite safe. I think Jan Anthony will probably agree, but I think we need to motivate language use, not per se for the sake of language itself, but for the sake of content. So he said several times, language is for communication, and I'd like to say also language is for content. And one myth that needs to be killed somehow is that monolinguals is more secure, more filtered, more calibrated, easier to follow. That is just rubbish. It's rubbish. And one of the big issue in the literature today is there a bilingual advantage? And we do all these micro tasks to see if you are a bit better in memory, a bit better inhibitory control, a bit better at X. But it's a joke. Because obviously the big advantage of bilingualism and multilingualism that is completely hidden so far, under the carpet somehow, is the extraordinary power of the conceptual explosion that brings a multilingual environment to the user. If you have different languages, you have different approach to the same problem. You have different perspective, you have different conception. You enrich your panoramic view of the field and the domain. So content is going to be much better communicated and much more elaborate, if you want, if it's conveyed multilingually. It's just bound to happen for the reasons of, because mixing doesn't cost anything, but also because, as I told you before, there is a huge advantage in looking at different ways language characterizes concepts, and we need to do that before we suffer from torchlight panic.
Jan, do you want to?
Yeah, I want to add to that it's our responsibility as members of plural societies to respond to this by changing the way we teach languages, and languages are included in the school system. First, because if we have a minority language, like it is your case, it is my case, if we want to preserve the use and the knowledge of that language, it should be included in the school. And then we need to be also respectful with other languages that are not the ones that we typically play with, be it the foreign or the minority or the official language, because we have pupils coming to schools from different environments with different languages, and this linguistic diversity should be dealt with. So I know that this is very conceptual, and sometimes it's difficult to give an answer to this, but it is mandatory. So we cannot forget that some people come to our schools without speaking the languages that typically are spoken in our schools. So it's our responsibility to be responsive to that too. And the last thing I want to say is that it's time now to change the concept of foreign language and bring it closer to our native scenario, so that we start quitting with the name of foreign language and making it just a non-native language. Because if we keep on teaching them as foreign languages, we already said, as Guillaume likes to put, a difference in space with them. Okay, so that differences in space should be broken, and languages should be included within our real proxim and closer scenario too.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Wel, ga i ddiolch yn fawr
Thank
iawn
you. So if I can thank you both for extremely valuable presentations and very rich presentations. And I'm certainly been given great benefit, and I've learned a lot about the work that's going on, not just internationally, but also here in Wales.